Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of The Benchmark, specifically looking at agriculture, and is released to coincide with the release of the monthly prices report. My name is Peter Story. I'm the head of prices for food and agricultural commodities. I'm joined here by Aled Thomas, who's an economist with the food retail and manufacturing team. How are you doing this month, Aled?
I'm great, thank you, Peter. How are you? It's been an exciting start to the new year, hasn't it?
Yes, a bit too exciting. Yes, so speaking of which, I suppose we should start with the main event, I guess you could call it that, which is the tariffs that have come into force following the inauguration of President Trump. Now, I think that we were both thinking about what we were going to say late last week, and it sort of seems like on Monday we thought, right, it's going to completely change again, and now we're here today on Tuesday, and it's completely changed again. So it is a very developing situation, I'm sure you would agree, but certainly to just give you a bit of an overview, um, Trump had threatened to place import tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico at 25% and to China at 10%. Now, these were threatened for day one. That didn't happen. Towards the end of January, I think there was even a bit of talk about whether or not it would happen in general. But then it got announced quite late last minute that these would go into force on the 1st of February. Now, over the weekend, it does seem like Canada and Mexico have come to a temporary agreement, shall we say, with the US, which is pushing back the implementation of these tariffs by a month. But they have come into force for China. So, with all that in mind, what exactly is the prospective fallout of certainly the Chinese tariffs which have been applied and the Canadian and Mexican tariffs which are due to be applied in a month's time, Alad?
Yeah, so there's obviously been a mixed response, like you say. I think we're probably on our fourth or fifth kind of reiteration of which way we're going with this. But I think it just goes to show how volatile perhaps food markets and agricultural markets could well be going into the rest of this new year. This new administration is, in the US particularly, is definitely one which throws surprises out the hat. But as you said, of course, the tariffs technically are going to come into place in a month's time or 30 days' time. They're only paused for now in Mexico and Canada, but they have come into force today for China. And in return, China have kind of tit for tat gone back with tariffs on US goods going into China as well. So the fallout for a tariff is quite an interesting one because it's being used by the Trump administration to flex muscle. But of course, when we look at it on a agriculture and food basis, ultimately it is going to mean an increase in things like electricity costs and food costs and supply costs into the country, into the US particularly. And of course, Donald Trump himself claimed how he was going to reduce food prices, etc., after being elected. So there is a lot of concern about how this will actually play out. Will the market stabilize themselves, or are we going to see prices for things such as, grains and oil seeds and soybeans, some of the things which China are kind of big players in, are they going to really see these tariffs hit them? And is that pass eventually going to be passed on to the consumer? So China is a big one to watch out. Are they going to hold out? It's coming to force today, but as we've seen tomorrow, we could be telling a complete different story again.
Absolutely. And I mean, with China and with Mexico and Canada, I mean, these are the US's main trading partners. I suppose it can't be understated just how much this can affect agriculture. So I know we both have quite strong backgrounds in the rice market, the global rice market, and if you're looking at specifically the US export market, Canada and Mexico are two of the main markets for US rice, and China has always been a market which the US has been trying to break into, obviously, because with its massive population, it just would be a really big boon for their industry. Um, and I don't think rice is really alone in there. I mean, think about soybeans and how much the US tries to ship its soybean crop to China. So, I mean, do you think that there are any other particular commodities which are going to be quite badly affected on the US side by these tariffs?
Well, I think If you look at it, the context of this, between Mexico, Canada, and China, it's around 45% of all imports into the US. And if this does come to fruition in places like Mexico, for example, we'll see it coming in right in the middle of when we have the kind of main fruit and vegetable seasons coming in to the US market. So it'll really, that'll be immediate pressures that people will probably see on a day-to-day basis because obviously, seasonality, things change quickly. It's not a sort of a stable price. So I think, the fruit and vegetable markets will be one to watch out, particularly those that come from hotter places like Mexico. And on the other side, I suppose, of the US in terms of Canada, there's things to look out there, such as energy supplies. A lot of energy, a
Mm.
commodity perhaps not necessarily directly linked to agriculture, but of course, many food preparations will require high energy inputs, and ultimately, like we say, that cost will probably get passed on to the consumer. It's very unlikely that the middlemen per se will bear the brunt of it. So I think one to watch out definitely will be Mexico if the tariffs do come into place in 30 days around certainly fresh fruit and vegetables, because that's something that key consumers in the US will be looking for. Supermarkets are always looking to make sure they've got constant supply on their shelves, so they will get that supply no matter the cost. And it's just a case of what sort of prices we'll see that come in if the tariffs do remain.
Mhm. Thanks, Howard. And just thinking a bit more broadly outside of these three main countries, there's been a lot of talk about maybe well, not even maybe, I believe Trump has even said definitely tariffs will be applied on the EU. There's also been threats on Colombia to implement tariffs there, specifically to pursue a political agenda, which is quite interesting. I mean, what sort of what does this mean for really the agri-trade landscape when doing business with the US at the moment?
Well, I think, suppliers, traders, everyone involved at every step of the market are going to be cautious about making long-term plans because those long-term plans could definitely be scuppered by one policy change. I think the interesting thing so far is if you look at the people you've mentioned, for example, Colombia, I think that threat came and went within a few days, and that was around deporting illegal migrants, etc., back to Colombia. Mexico and Canada, both bordering the US, and there's a lot of discussion around fentanyl, etc., getting in, and it does seem very focused about US borders at the moment. And the question is, when we've heard things in the past week around the European Union and the finger pointing, saying that the European Union have treated the US very, very badly, I think was Donald Trump's words. The immigration issue doesn't really ring true in terms of the EU. So it starts to get interesting then when if he comes for the continent of Europe and starts placing tariffs over here, what will his agenda be? And that's, I think, the interesting thing going forward. I've heard it kind of muted that it's potentially around 10% tariffs that he's looking at. But again, it's changing so rapidly. It's very hard for anyone in the agricultural community to plan ahead, especially when it comes to trade and domestic trade. And of course, a lot of the things that I think some people perhaps forget some of the time is, of course, when products are produced in country, the transport times are very, very quick. But in terms of, like you said, rice production or any sort of bulk shipments, it does take a significant amount of time to get that ship from one place to another. So while we hear about these impacts today, it might actually be 2, 3, 4 months down the line before we actually really get those figures through in terms of US food inflation, etc., on how they're affecting markets, not just in the US, but of course in all the surrounding countries that Trump has threatened tariffs on.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only thing that we can realistically hope for right now is that this video is still vaguely relevant by the time people start to watch it. So just moving on, but sticking with the US, one of the things, well, one of the big topics out of there over the past few weeks has been the wildfires out in California, specifically in the south of California. Is there much of a view about whether or not this has impacted agriculture in this quite, well, very agricultural state, I suppose you could say?
No, it is an interesting one, and I think the initial thought perhaps is that it would have had a relatively large effect, but actually drilling down and looking kind of at reports and at the data, it's very unlikely that these fires will have actually had a massive impact so far to date on agriculture. Most of the fires have been around sort of urbanish areas and woodland, of course, as you'd expect. It doesn't seem to see at the moment that key agricultural producing areas will have had a massive impact. But saying that, there is still going to be a significant amount of smoke and air pollution. And as Californian farmers go into the spring and look at planting their kind of crops for the forthcoming year, it is likely that there possibly could be some sort of pollution effects on the growing of the plants because of course they suck in all the oxygen and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we could be seeing a potentially delayed effect by reduced yields. So much could happen in the next 12 months that it might be difficult to correlate that. But the initial reaction is nothing major to be worried about in terms of agriculture and food production from the Californian state so far, mainly around the concerns will be around transport, etc., and things like that, things which will be directly impacted by road closures and debris.
Mhm. Okay, well, thanks, Alan. And lastly, just turning to that fun topic of animal diseases, it seems like they've been an increasing concern for a lot in the livestock industries, both dairy and for meat, in the past number of months. I mean, can you give us a bit of an update on what's really been going on there and how it's looking for 2025?
So there have been a whole host of diseases spreading about the globe. It's not concentrated to one place. We've had reports in the last few months of foot and mouth disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, also known as mad cow disease, has been seen recently. Highly pathogenic avian influenza, African swine fever, blue tongue. All of these animal diseases are kind of floating about in various places across the globe currently. And some definitely should be considered and worried about more than others. And I think it is worth noting, something like foot and mouth disease, while it's only been diagnosed in one case in Germany so far in a herd of water buffalo. If you put that in context around how that reaction of a contagious disease like that can affect markets, around 10,000 tons of pork comes from Germany to the UK monthly. So it, UK have put a ban on all German meat imports essentially into the country. So where does that mean? That 10,000 tons per month of pork has to go somewhere. So it's going to have a major effect on other EU markets. They're going to want to get rid of it. They need to sell it. It's not something that can just be stored for long periods of time as it's fresh. And the German association, the DRV, are saying that they reckon that that one outbreak in that herd, which hasn't yet to have spread, will have probably have cost the industry around 1 billion euros. So animal diseases like this don't come cheap.
Mhm.
As well as that, we've seen things in the US like the bird flu or a highly pathogenic avian influenza. Interestingly enough, this one can be spread not just in birds, as you can imagine, but it also can be spread through cattle and dairy. And we've seen things like 28 states now, which is nearly two-thirds of US milk production, are part of bulk milk testing to try and see where the H5N1 strain of the avian influenza is. And that's come as an extra 15 states in the new year joined the national milk testing strategy. Smaller.
Now, just on that though, Alan, I mean, I don't want to dismiss avian flu, but in some ways, is that quite seasonal? Is it to an extent baked in to the market, or is this yes, or this season anyway, especially bad?
No, this is definitely a worse season for it so far, and it's significantly impacted both broiler and layer frocks across the US. And I think one of the main reasons that many people are concerned is one animal disease outbreak at a time is something that governments and government departments can probably deal with. But when you compile all of these disease outbreaks together, there sometimes just isn't the manpower to make sure that the disinfectant can happen as quickly as possible. I think one thing to note, perhaps, and it's quite important, that some of these diseases, not all of them, some can be passed on to humans, some can't. But I think the majority of the diseases, and specifically the more spreadable ones, such as highly pathogenic avian influenza, are not as susceptible to humans as some of the others. So it is, I think, certain level of animal disease is baked into production. You're always going to consider that sort of loss. But it does feel that this has been rolling on and grumbling on, and people have been ramping up efforts, whereas perhaps pre-Christmas they thought it was coming to a sort of a halt, really.
Mhm. And I know we're a bit pressed for time, but could you give a bit of an update on blue tongue? Because that's one that certainly I haven't been too familiar with in the past, but it's certainly been talked about quite a lot lately. So is that the flavor of the month, would you say right now?
Well, blue tongue is an interesting one actually, because Europe itself has been dealing with blue tongue since around 1998. It's not something that's necessarily new, but I think the market and certainly agricultural markets on the continent in Europe have sort of dealt with it and got it to a low level. The issue with blue tongue and the reason why it's now kind of come back to be a big talking point is there's a new strain, as we know, with diseases, etc. This new strain comes out, and then things like antibiotics, antivirals, etc., don't work anymore. So that's the stereotype three, which is BTV minus three. And that's the big issue at the moment. And what it's meant is it was confirmed just in December that Poland had contracted this certain strain, and as a result, we've seen China banning indirect imports of ruminant animals from places like Poland and Croatia. So while blue tongue itself has been prevalent really in Europe for decades, this new strain is really causing some issues in terms of trade across the globe.
So, okay, well, thank you so much for your insights, Alad. Always a pleasure speaking with you. And thank you very much for everyone listening back at home. Thanks.